Hey, what's up, Rim Church? If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Austin Johnson, and I am so excited for today as we continue going through the book of Genesis together. Because today, specifically, we're going to be looking at the story of Noah. Now, there's a good chance that if you grew up in church or you went to a VBS as a kid, you've heard the story of Noah. It's not necessarily a new story to our culture, but you probably thought about the story of Noah looking something like this. Kind of like this cute picture of Noah and the ark with the animals. But if for some reason, maybe you lived under a rock and you didn't hear the story of Noah in church growing up or in VBS, then probably late at night when surfing TV channels was still a thing, you probably caught the tail end of the Russell Crowe movie Noah, or you caught the adaptation through Evan Almighty. So there's this idea that it's not a new story for us in our culture. We have a lot of different explanations and ideas and kind of movies and books that talk about this flood story, Noah and the flood. But what's interesting is just like our culture, this isn't necessarily a new story. The same can be true for the cultural context of Noah's day. So we're as a church trying to think not just as Westerners and asking the how and the what, but we're asking the who and the why as Easterners. So the ancient Hebrews, their culture, the cultures surrounding them, the flood narrative wasn't actually a new idea. Most cultures, in fact, actually had their own flood narrative. It actually extends back to the Bronze Age and the Neolithic prehistory. But with all these various flood stories, there's a common theme. There's a flood, but most of them are global in scale, and they're usually sent by some deity or deities that are going to destroy humanity as an act of divine retribution. So as we think about this from an Eastern perspective, flood narratives aren't new to the cultural context of the day, but we're beginning to ask, what does this flood story actually tell us about who God is and what he's really like? Why did he flood the earth? Those are kind of the ideas that we're going to be dealing with. Now, as we think about Noah and the flood, there are some common questions from a Western perspective that come up, and that's probably like, okay, how did the flood happen? When did the flood happen? Did it cause the Grand Canyon? Was it millions of years ago or thousands of years ago? Is this when dinosaurs became extinct? And how did the birds, the snakes fit together in the ark and not like, you know, attack each other? Elephants, how did these massive animals fit on the ark? They built the ark around the elephants. I mean, we literally have a kind of theme park totally built around those questions. And while those aren't necessarily the wrong questions, I think to do this text most accurately, that's not the perspective this text is written from and written to. It's written to this Eastern mindset of what is this story trying to tell us about who God is, in contrast to these false views around us, around the culture, and why did this actually happen? So my hope here today, really even in this Eastern perspective of trying to do the text justice, is this idea that this story isn't actually about Noah. It's actually a story about God. We've been looking at Scripture and I've been saying this is a story that's not about humans, it's actually about God. He is the main character. This is his story. And this story is no different. This isn't a story about Noah, it's a story about God, God's grief over humanity's brokenness, and his response. What does God actually think about the sin and the brokenness that's gone on in the world? A lot of us in a lot of cultures have this idea that God is angry, he's pissed off, he's probably feeling out of control, he's absent, he's abandoned humanity, and so the consequence is now he's going to wipe them all out. And what does that mean for me today? Does that now mean that if God's angry and pissed off at me because of sin, that mean I have to try and manage sin myself and do that in isolation? That a lot of us feel abandoned, that I can't have a relationship with God, not really and truly, until I figure out the sin and the brokenness in my life. Or that's keeping us from some level of intimacy. And unless I do or think the right things, then God's not actually going to be happy with me. I feel like I can't have a relationship with God so long as there's this sin and brokenness. So I should probably fix a couple things before we can really begin a relationship. So what does this story about God actually tell us about what he's like and what he thinks about our sin? Before we get into the story of Noah, let's recap what we've seen in the story so far. So in the story, we've seen that this is a story about God. Throughout the whole story, we see that he is the only one who always does what's good, right, and perfect. It's God's story, and it's huge, and it includes everything and everyone, and it should affect everything and everyone. The story begins in the beginning, where we see God making a good and beautiful world out of unlivable chaos. He makes humanity in his image, and he gives him the job to care for and rule over all of his creation so it can flourish. Humanity is then given the choice to trust in God or to trust in themselves. And pretty quickly, humanity begins to think that we have a better idea of how things should be run here on earth. And they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, choosing to live in their own ways instead of his ways. The Bible calls this sin. Humanity was meant to be fruitful and multiply, filling the earth with God's goodness and beauty, cultivating its hidden potential, but instead hardship, pain, wickedness, evil, and ultimately death has multiplied, as humanity has rejected God's ways for their own. But despite humanity's rejection, we continue to see God pursuing his creation, looking for a relationship of trust, and promising that one day he's going to send a hero to rescue his creation from the brokenness of this world. And so with that, it's kind of a recap of the story. We're going to jump into our story today. So if you have a copy of your scripture, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 5. Now, I want to read a selection of verses. There's a lot of narrative here, but to give us kind of a brief overview of the story of Noah. This is Genesis 6, starting in verse 5. When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I created off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. These are the family records of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God, and Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with wickedness. God saw how corrupt the earth was, for every creature had corrupted its way on the earth. Then God said to Noah, I've decided to put an end to every creature, for the earth is filled with wickedness because of them. Therefore I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. So make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms inside of the ark, and I'm going to bring all of these animals to you. This is verse 17. Understand that I'm bringing a flood waters on the earth to destroy every creature under heaven with the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. We're going to talk about covenant next week. So verse 22, and Noah did everything that God had commanded him. Then the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Then God gives Noah instructions to bring 2 of each type of animal onto the ark. And then jump down to verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the sources of the vast watery depths burst open. The floodgates of the sky were opened, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Verse 17. The flood continued for 40 days on the earth. The water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. Verse 24. And the water surged on the earth 150 days. God remembered Noah, as well as all the wildlife and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water began to subside. Verse 3, the water steadily receded from the earth, and by the end of 150 days, the water had decreased significantly. Verse 6, after 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he made, and he sent out a raven, and went back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Verse 10, so Noah waited 7 more days, and he sent out the dove from the ark again. Verse 12, After he had waited another 7 days, he sent out the dove, but it did not return to him again. And in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, the water that had covered the earth was dried up. Then Noah removed the ark's cover and saw that the surface of the ground was drying. This is verse 15. Then the Lord spoke to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out all the living creatures that are with you, birds, livestock, those that crawl on the earth. They will spread over the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah, along with his sons, his wives, and his sons' wives, they came out. And all the animals came out of the ark by their families. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. He took some of every kind of clean animal and every kind of clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, he said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground because of human beings, even though the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth onwards. And I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done. As long as the earth endures seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night will not cease." So that's kind of the overview of the story of Noah, which is like, wow, a lot just happened, right? But it's really important to start at the beginning of this narrative. The first thing we see is so important because it totally sets the stage for everything else that we're going to see. And our introduction, remember, this is a story not about Noah, but this is a story about God. That's kind of the perspective we're going to be seeing today. And our introduction to God in this narrative is that he sees the widespread human wickedness, and he sees that the inclination of human heart is evil. So let's remember, what was God's purpose in creating humanity? It was to bear his image, to rule, and to reign as his image bearers that would multiply and fill the earth with his glory. But instead of the earth being increasingly filled with God's glory, his beauty, and goodness, we see that the earth is being increasingly filled with wickedness, pain, corruption, and ultimately death. Sin has multiplied and nobody has escaped the consequences of it. But what's interesting in this story, and this is where it really begins to be, it's a story about God, as we get a glimpse into what does God think and what does God feel about the brokenness and corruption and sin of his creation. Now, this story can have a tendency of being preached and taught from the perspective of, we said this before, a lot of us can feel the same way when we think about the sin and brokenness in our lives. The perspective that God is angry, he's pissed off, he's distant, he's upset with us, and ultimately because of that, he's going to destroy us, right? But we see that at the beginning of this story, that could not be farther from the truth. We see here a God not who is distant or absent or has abdicated humanity when the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth. I mean, there's an idea that, God sees, he's up close and he's personal. He sees not just what's happening on the outside, but he sees what's going on in the hearts of man. So that's telling us that God is personal, he's present. He's not absent. A God who doesn't just see what's happening on the outside, but a God who sees our hearts on the inside, the real us. He's not a God of distance, but he's a God of presence. And so God sees human wickedness, the evil inclination of humanity's heart, and what is his response? Is it anger? Does it him feel like he's out of control? Is it abandonment? Abdication? No. It's grief. It's sorrow. Verse 6, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. When God sees the corruption and brokenness of his creation, he's not filled with anger, but with sadness. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It was supposed to be humanity multiplying God's image, multiplying the beauty and the goodness as his image bearers. But instead, what's being multiplied is sin, pain, wickedness, corruption, and ultimately death. There's this idea that God is grieved and he's sorrowful. That this is a story about God and God's grief over what's happened in his creation. He created humans to be his image bearers that would reflect his glory. But humanity has continued to define for themselves what's good and what's right. That's led to their corruption. That's led to the wickedness and pain, to the point that even the inclination of the human heart has become corrupted. Nothing in creation has escaped. This was not how it was supposed to be. So what does this tell us? What does God actually feel about sin in the world, in his creation, about sin in our lives, about the brokenness in our world? I think it tells us about his character, that he's grieved by sin. When he sees his creation not living into its design and purpose, when he sees the effect of sin, it's not being angry and feeling out of control, it's sadness. His creation has turned on itself in a decisive way, and God is stricken with grief. We see here in this story that he is a God that sees his creation, that sees humanity. He sees you. He sees the innermost parts of us. He sees the brokenness in you and around you, and he isn't pissed off or out of control. He's grieved and he's sad because it wasn't supposed to be this way. Now, I just wonder, for so many of us, maybe we've had an unhelpful and untrue view of God. When we think about the sin and brokenness in the world, in our life, we think God is angry at us. But how would your view of God, your circumstances, your sin change if you begin to believe that God wasn't this angry deity who's pissed off and angry? That was the narrative of all the other flood stories. That he's angry, there's divine retribution coming. But he was sorrowful and grieving. This is a crisis about the resistant character of the world, which evokes hurt and grief in the heart of God. We see God who is directly impacted by the pain, hurt, suffering, and circumstance of the world. What would begin to change if we actually believe that God was grieved over our sin? There's sorrow. And now we begin to see it's out of this sorrow, out of this grief, that God brings the flood. This totally changes how you view the context of the flood. It's not from a place of anger and of sorrow, but it's this idea of God is beginning anew. Now, you may be a pragmatist, and you may be going, yeah, but God still kind of wiped everybody out, right? But let's think about that for a moment. What have we seen so far that evil, rebellion, and violence of humanity has led to? It's death. That's the end result of humanity's choice to do what's good and right in their own eyes. That's already the human destination. So here's the question. In the flood, is God really changing the consequence of humanity's sin? Or is he actually shortening the consequence of their sin? Their sin is already leading them to pain, already leading them to suffering, already leading them to death. So is he actually changing the consequence of their sin? Or is he changing the duration of it? God isn't ending their destruction. That's already their human destination. But instead of allowing humanity to continue to slide further and further into more pain, chaos, destruction, and evil, God decides to start over. He decides to step in as an act of mercy to restrain humanity's ever-increasing evil. And yet, we see that God still does not abandon his creation. Now, we've seen in the story that God is just, and he will not let sin and corruption go undealt with, but he's also merciful. So despite the sinfulness of humanity and the corruption of creation's original goodness, God acts to save a remnant of humanity. In the midst of this brokenness, we find a man named Noah. And Noah is introduced onto the scene as someone who's righteous, and he's blameless, and he walks with God, unlike his contemporaries. In the future, we'll see in the story of Abraham, this idea of righteous. Abraham believed in God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Really, it's just this idea of trust, that faith. So Noah trusts God. And we've seen this before in the story, that ultimately God has always been looking for a relationship, not of perfection, but of trust with humanity. So Noah has a relationship of trust with God, but it also says that he's blameless. Now, it's important. We just talked about the effects of the fall have spread to all of humanity. So Noah is sinful. The inclination of his heart is wicked. Nobody has been left untouched. So it's not like Noah's sinless. So what makes him special is that he's blameless. What does that mean? Now think about in the story so far. Every time something has gone wrong and humanity has done what's right in their own eyes, and then God comes and checks back in, what have humans done? They've blamed someone else for their issues. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. In the story of Cain and Abel, when Cain kills his brother and God asks him what happened, he shifts the blame and says, "Who is my brother's keeper?" And then we get to Noah. His name literally means rest. And there's this idea of he is called blameless, unlike the other major characters we've seen in the story so far. And blameless is just simply this idea that he's no longer blaming someone else for the sin in his life. He isn't blaming it on his kids, his wife, or anyone else. He's blameless. He's blaming less. He's not blaming someone else. It's his responsibility that I'm a sinner. And so God sees Noah, this righteous and blameless man that's walking in a relationship of trust with him, and he says, this is who I'm going to start over with. This is families where I'm going to begin anew. Which I think this tells us massive things about what God is looking for in humanity. Not just in Noah, but in all of humanity. He's looking for a relationship of trust. Not of perfection, but of trust. The story of Adam and Eve and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad and the tree of life. God's looking for a relationship of trust. The story of Cain and Abel. Abel brought an offering in a relationship of trust. Cain did not. What we'll see in the story of Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, David, God is after a relationship of trust. So God sees Noah, this righteous, blameless man who's operating in a relationship of trust. This man and his family is where God will begin anew. And so he tells him to build an ark made of wood. And this ark would be God's vehicle for protection, preservation, and ultimate redemption of humanity and his creation. So Noah builds this ark. He does everything that God commands him to do. God brings these animals to board the ark so as to preserve not just humanity, but all of creation. And the flood begins. Now, I'm not going to go into all these details. You can check it out for yourself in the text this week. But as the narrative moves into the flood beginning, submerging the earth, stopping, and then receding, there's a couple of interesting things that are happening. The flood coming, it actually mirrors the creation order. You'll begin to see that the methodical way that God created the earth, light, expanse, land, seasons, birds, animals, there's an undoing that's being done in the flood. There's no light. The expanse is going away. The land is going away. And then we see that there's this moment as God is being recreated, the flood is going away, that, man, now there's light. The expanse is coming back. Land is appearing. There's a mirroring that's happening. That God is cleansing his creation. It's being made anew. But then there's this amazing verse right in the middle of this whole story, and it's Genesis 8:1. It says this: God remembered Noah as well as all the wildlife and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. Now remember, this story is a flood narrative that there are other flood narratives in the world. So this is trying to teach us something new and true about God. And this story is teaching us that he's a God who's present. He's not angry, he's pissed off. He's grieved by sin. He's sorrowful. He's brokenhearted over the brokenness of humanity. We see that he's a God who remembers. Now, this idea of remembering, it's not suggesting a lapse in God's memory, like you literally forget, but remembering signals that God is actively moving to deliver Noah from the waters. The Lord is a saving God. Judgment is not his final verdict. He has a mission. Humanity's sin disrupted God's creational intentions, but God's mission will prevail. So the floodwaters, they dissipate. And the ark comes to rest on top of a mountain, and Noah and his family, they exit the ark. And then we see God has not given up on humanity. He's a God that is grieved over the brokenness and sin of humanity and creation. And yet, he hasn't given up on humanity. Through Noah, this man who's operating a relationship of trust. What is God looking for? A relationship of trust. But then what does God do? As they come out of the ark, God does something incredible. He remissions humanity. He gives them the command to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth with his glory and with his image. God's mission has not changed, and humanity's invitation to join him in that mission remains the same. But here's the crazy thing. God remissions them knowing full well that human hearts are still going to be bent towards the same evil and wickedness. This is Genesis 8. The end of verse 17. Be fruitful and multiply on the earth. And then you jump down to 21. I will never again curse the ground because of human beings, even though the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth onward. God remissions them knowing full well that they're still broken and they're still jacked up. They still don't have their lives figured out. But here's what we need to hear today. This is really a story about God, his grief. He still hasn't given up on humanity and his ultimate mission. God did not wait for humanity to figure out their sin before he sent them back out to join him in the mission of restoration. He sends out a broken Noah with his broken sons back out with a renewed mission. Not after they were right, but in the midst of them being broken. Why? Because God is looking for a relationship of trust. And so as the church, and when I say the church, I mean us as the church, how is that going? Living out that mission. We've talked about so many of us, we believe that maybe our sin is keeping us from a relationship with God, or it's keeping us from getting to God's purpose in our life. When we look at this story, we see that God isn't looking for humanity to have it totally figured out. He knows as he sends them out on the mission, the only way it's going to happen is through a relationship with him, a continued relationship of trust. And so we need to see here today as the church, just like Noah, we have been remissioned. He isn't waiting for our sin problems to be totally solved before we get out there and begin to image him. We don't have to have all the right answers to people's questions before we live out the mission God has invited us into. So what would begin to change in your life, in the life of your community, in your family, if you actually believe that you've been remissioned right now? Not after you figured it all out, but right now. How would that change who you talk to? Who sits at your dinner table? Who you invite to a dinner party? God isn't pissed off trying to destroy his creation. He has a mission and his sin has grieved his heart, and he's looking for a relationship of trust. Because this isn't just a story with Noah as the character. Because if you and I are living in a relationship of trust with God, then this is our story too. Living in a broken and fallen world, yet walking in a relationship of trust with God, and having been sent on mission to restore all things. But how is that going? For a lot of us, we probably haven't received our invitation to mission because we still think God is angry at us, that he's abdicated our life, or that we have to clean ourselves up or figure out our sin before we really get out there on mission with God, or we really begin a relationship with God. Our dinner tables might be empty. We don't know the names of our neighbors or praying for them. We don't view people as fellow image bearers. I think it's probably safe to say that we haven't fully received our invitation to mission. But this is a story about God. God's grief over sin and over brokenness. That he hasn't given up on humanity. And that his mission is still alive. And we see this perfectly in the life of Jesus. That there is one that out of God's grief and brokenness over sin, he didn't give up on humanity, and he actually stepped into our neighborhood. Jesus came perfectly living out the mission of God to redeem and pay for the sins of humanity once and for all. Jesus, this true and better Noah, who walked in a total relationship of trust, who wasn't just blameless, but was sinless. And he dealt with the sin and brokenness of this world. While we were still sinners, he did this. Just like in the story of Noah, God didn't wait for humanity to figure it out or to clean themselves up before he stepped in. Same thing in the story of Jesus. There's a passage in the New Testament. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God's present. He's broken over sin. And while we were still sinners, before we had it figured out, that's when Christ came and died. He's gracious, so we don't have to prove ourselves to God. We don't have to prove ourselves to other people. We don't have to prove ourselves to ourselves. We get to rest in the finished work of Jesus. And now we, image bearers, we get to join Jesus in this remission to go and fill the earth with God's glory. And so today, this is the question. This story about God. He's grieved over sin, but he hasn't abandoned humanity. And his mission is still alive. He's not angry. He's sorrowful. He sees you. He hasn't abandoned you. He's actually present. And he's not asking for a relationship of perfection, but a relationship of trust. And in that relationship of trust, he sent us out to be his image bearers. With Jesus going before us, as we do it imperfectly, Jesus has finished it. He's done it perfectly. What is God saying to you? How do you get to live in response? Church, we love you, and we'll see you next time.